Hey there, welcome to another Connect Live. My name is Seth Juarez with Channel 9, and we have some pretty cool people. Why don't we take a quick second to introduce yourselves, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. Is that okay? We'll start here, and then we'll make our way down. What's your name? What do you do?
My name is Glenn Condren. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team, particularly on the core runtime team. So the new ASP.NET 5 stack, the DNX, if you're familiar with that, and we'll talk about it later, and the runtime parts of that.
Awesome.
Yeah, Ryan J. Salva. I'm a PM on the Tools for Apache Cordova team. My larger team also works on TypeScript and Windows Store applications using JavaScript.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'm Mads Christensen, and I work on the web experiences in Visual Studio, HTML, CSS, LESS, SAS, JSON.
So just anything web-related tooling.
Anything web-related tooling, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we are taking questions live on the Channel 9 page for this event, or if you want to use the hashtag, see that, the cool kids do this, ConnectLive will take your questions. Anything related to these things. If it's out of the scope of that, we might just say we don't know and we're okay with that. Let me start with you, Glenn. So there's been a lot of changes with ASP.NET version 5. There's a new name DNX, there's the DNU, there's the DN something. Can you help me make sense of all of what's going on and how you can sort of think about it?
Sure. Okay, so there's when we started to build ASP.NET 5, we had this thing. We want to run in more locations than we ever have. We want to be cross-platform. We want to work on Mac. We want to work on Linux. We want to work everywhere we can. And part of the problem with that is, and we wanted to work on Core CLR, this new Core CLR that people have been talking about. Part of the problem with that is the way that you get an app running on Mono or Core CLR or full desktop CLR that everybody knows and loves today is kind of different. So what we needed to build was some common thing you could build on top of that it would, under the covers, take care of booting the right CLR for you. That thing originally was the K runtime, which is now the DNX, which is the first thing that you talked about.
So that's the runtime.
It's the runtime. It's the thing that takes care of, it will take care of loading the CLR. In the case of Core CLR, it actually boots it in, like potentially inside your application, and it finds your startup CS in the case of your web application, and it runs it. Eventually, there's a little bit more detail.
And when you say Core CLR, it's a literal .NET sort of framework that's portable, right?
Absolutely. So in Core CLR's case, you can actually take effectively Core CLR DLL, which is everything, which is the entire CLR, and have it inside the bin folder of your application, for a better word, and that's the one that gets run.
That's amazing.
So you can actually, there's a command with DNU, which is the DNX utilities.
Okay.
Which will bundle your web application, which basically takes, you have your source control view of the world. Bundling will take your, I think we call it publish now actually.
Okay.
Sorry. Publishing will take your source control view of the world and generate a new folder, which will include everything you need to run, including, if you're on Core CLR, the CLR itself.
Interesting.
So you've got one folder, there'll be like a little batch file in there, which if you could double click to start to like self-host your app, or you could point IIS at it, and it's a completely self-contained world. It doesn't interact with any other applications on the machine, no other web applications, anything like that.
And so it feels like you have sort of a lot of command line sort of tools to make these ASP.NET 5. Previously, I was used to just having a menu item in Visual Studio, but now you need to have an executable for each one of those
as
things.
part of being cross-platform, what we thought was, Visual Studio is great.
Yeah.
So everybody on Windows is covered. Visual Studio is awesome. But if we're going to work on Mac and we're going to work on Linux, what about these guys? We're going to give them something, right? So what we started to work on was, okay, let's build the command line experience and have the Visual Studio tooling everywhere as possible, do things via the command line tools.
Got it.
So what I work on is, most of the stuff that I do builds command line tooling, and these people like Mads build UIs in Visual Studio, and eventually under the covers it's going to call the command line tooling.
I see.
Right? So it's kind of a little bit of a shift. Historically, that's not really the way that we built tooling. But what it does mean is that for maybe not the first time, but for right now, you can do everything the Visual Studio does could be accomplished by the command line as well. So you often, when you see talks, especially by us that are on the team, you'll see us dive to the command line a lot because we kind of know the command line how it works, which is a kind of a new thing and it scares a lot of people. However, you should know that this is the same thing that Visual Studio is doing. You should be able to do everything in Visual Studio as well. We're just kind of trying to remove concepts in talks and stuff. But yeah, so DNX, the thing that runs your application.
Okay.
DNU is basically a collection of utilities. Most of the utilities in there are the same as you would get from NuGet.exe today.
I see.
They're things like restore all the NuGet packages in my application, things like that. But the reason it's not just NuGet.exe, it wraps NuGet.exe. You could logically think of it as like when you do some commands in there, it's just calling out to like NuGet.exe, right, effectively. But there's a few things in there that aren't NuGet, like you use the DNU utility to build your application.
I see.
Or to bundle your application or pack. One of the things that you do with ASP.NET 5 that you didn't get historically is if you build your app, what you get at the other end is a NuGet package.
Interesting.
And if you build any of the projects that run on top of the DNX itself, you can create like a class library, for example, and the only difference between that class library and anything else is just that you get a NuGet package out of the other end, and it's automatically for you in Magic and things like that. Yeah, so that's DNU, and you can publish. It's anything to do with packages and building and taking your application and getting it into another format.
So DNU is a set of tools then?
It is. It's one command line, so you go DNU, but it does a bunch of things.
Got it.
And if you do just type DNU at the command line, after you've got everything set up for the command line, you'll get some help. The third thing is DNVM, which is the DN other thing that you said.
That's right.
So when you think about core CLR, so you could imagine theoretically a machine that doesn't have desktop.NET on it, right? Full .NET.
Right.
And you've got to get a DNX. And how do you get a DNX if you don't have any .NET or yet?
Right.
So DNVM is the thing to get you a DNX to be able to run your application. And it also allows you to switch between them. Because Core CLR can be completely self-contained, I could have, on my machine at the moment, I've got like 50 different DNXs on my machine, all different nightly builds and different bits. And with DNVM, I can get new ones from the feed, just DNVM upgrade, and it'll go grab a new DNX, download it, put it on my machine in my user profile. Then inside Visual Studio, there's a drop-down. I can go select it in there. There'll also probably be an MSI. If I wanted to just go from stable releases, I could probably go just grab an MSI, double-click it, and select the drop-down, never go to the command line. But if I do go to the command line, I can do things like 2 different applications on the same machine, both running different .NET
Core CLRs,
complete Core CLRs. I can use one on this command prompt, and when I run over here, I'm using that one. On this command prompt, I could have a different one. I'm running a different one over
Interesting.
here. Could do all sorts of crazy stuff, and that's what DNVM lets you do. Yeah, it also does a bunch of other cool things, like it'll generate native images just for your machine as it downloads it, and a bunch of cool stuff like that. And it's just a PowerShell script. All it does is make some HTTP requests and modify your path a little bit. That's about it.
Interesting. So it feels like you are working on sort of like how ASP.NET runs. This is a good segue over to the stuff that Mads does. You're actually doing tooling on building websites. Building modern websites feels a lot more complicated than, say, even a couple of years ago. There's tons of stuff out there. I personally get confused. There's like NPM, there's Bower, there's Grunt, there's a bunch of things. How do you help us make sense of that as Visual Studio developers?
Well, that's a good challenge because it's really important that we focus on what's right and we don't necessarily rat hole on supporting specific frameworks that might have a shorter lifespan. And you don't really know when you have a new framework coming up like once a week. You don't really know like what's the lifetime of this. Is it like a fluke, or is it going to be the new Angular or jQuery or whatever? So our focus is how do we lift the entire story of web development, whether that's CSS frameworks or JavaScript libraries or what it might be. And so that's sort of the dance that we do. But we have some great new features in Visual Studio 2015. So first of all, we're supporting all of the stuff that Glenn was mentioning, right? So the way that the command line part of ASP.NET is sort of, Visual Studio just calls that behind the scenes. We're doing that with some of the new JavaScript-based frameworks as well. So for instance, for Bower and NPM, Grunt and Gulp, we're doing the exact same thing. So think of Bower and NPM, those are package managers, just like NuGet is a package manager. Bower is typically used for client-side packages. It could be Bootstrap CSS framework, it could be AngularJS or Bootstrap.js, something that lives in the client side, right?
Right.
And then we have NuGet, we still have that, and that takes care of all like our server-side components, and like DLL files or something .NET. And finally, we have NPM, which is the Node package manager, and we use that now to bring in tooling. And so this is a very new thing. And it actually gives us access to ecosystems that exist out there that are huge. Right? So there are thousands of Bower packages, there are thousands of NPM packages, and now there are first-class citizens in Visual Studio and to all web developers that
The crazy thing is, I saw on the actual website there was 1 billion downloads of packages just last month on Node.js. That is ridiculous. And so now we have access to all of that in Visual Studio.
Yep.
How do you surface that, and how does it help us?
I can show that.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's see what
Should
you
we
got.
go for it? All right. So, so I prepared a very simple website here. It's actually just an empty ASP.NET 5 project. And so it has absolutely nothing in it. It has a project JSON, which is the new ASP.NET 5 sort of manifest file, if you want. And in here, I can, we have this notion of a root. And we see that folder is shown in the Solution Explorer right here.
Right.
So that means that's where all my public files go and all my static assets, things that will be served to the browser.
Right.
Not my running C#, right? My Razor views or my C# code.
Got it.
But stuff like images, style sheets, and so on go in there. And this is optional. So I can go in here, and instead of having .root, I can put a dot. And as soon as I save my project JSON file, Visual Studio does some cool things. It automatically reloads all the packages. It's restoring. In this case, I have like a couple of NuGet packages we can see right here.
Right.
It's restoring those. But it also removed my .root. So now I can just delete that folder right here. So see here, we got another icon. Now it's just a folder. So let's just get rid of that. Again, this is optional if you don't want that. Now that means that the root of my project is also the root of my static content, right? So this is sort of back to what we had with website projects in the past. This is simple, basically a folder-based experience. And let's say I want to deal with client-side automation. This is a difficult topic. Compiling less and Sass and CoffeeScript and TypeScript files.
Yeah.
Bundling JavaScript and CSS, minifying them. There's a whole client-side workflow or build process there. And historically, we hadn't done much except for TypeScript, which had great tooling support in Visual Studio for compiling. With ASP.NET 5, that has to be run through a client-side task runner. And so we have built-in support for 2 of those, and those are Grunt and Gulp, right? And so they're basically based on Node.js, and they allow us to run tasks such as less compilation, TypeScript, and bundling and minification. And they all have huge ecosystems out there of available tasks. So,
and Matt, real quick here, like one thing to kind of point out, these are not replacements for MS Build task, right? This is extra goodness on top of, so you can still have your MS Build tasks running side by side,
Right.
and then you add Grunt and Gulp task for client-side processing side.
Absolutely. And it feels like MS Build is more like server-type building stuff, whereas these other task runners are for client-side stuff.
Yep.
Because their browser's not going to read less.
right.
So the other thing is that, as I said earlier, the whole point of a lot of this was this big cross-platform development environment. It seemed fairly likely to us that we would have environments where some people were on a Mac, some people were on Windows machines, for example, as their development blocks. And so you need to kind of support those people as much as you can in places where, at least initially, they won't necessarily be MS Build. So
Just trying to make the build tasks portable.
Yeah, you try and make it more portable, right? So the guy on the Mac, who maybe your designer guy is on a Mac, and he doesn't need to necessarily do a full build, but he needs to be able to modify the CSS, have it compiled and minified, and then able to see the differences, right? And then the devs will build it with the full build system.
Yeah, so the notion is that we want to be in a situation where you can build an ASP.NET 5 web app, and one team member can be on Windows using Visual Studio, and another team member can be on a Mac using Sublime Text and the command line. And they can work on the exact same project. There's nothing Visual Studio specific going on for the Visual Studio user. Under the hood, they use the exact same command line and the exact same tools. So that's super important for the whole cross-plat story, but it also is super powerful because there are so many available tasks that does all sorts of crazy stuff that's really helpful.
So that means you pretty much have like a developer working on a Windows box over here, on the same team, someone working on a Mac over here, same project, use it, no
Same
problem.
tools,
Exactly.
in fact.
Same tools,
for running
yeah.
tasks, for getting packages down, for restoring stuff.
Yeah.
Exactly. So what we're doing on the Visual Studio side is that we're saying, instead of you having to fall back to the command line, what would be the ideal workflow
Right.
for using all these tools like NPM, Bower, Grunt, and Gulp. For a Visual Studio user, like what is the workflow, what is the muscle memory that we need to keep intact so that it makes it super easy and much more productive. And I think we've landed that pretty good. So I want to show how we can very easily add a package from the Node Package Manager NPM.
Let's do it.
Yeah. So as I said, this is a completely empty project. If you use our other project templates, you will see we have already hooked all this up. But let's just start, just to make it super easy to see what's going on. So just like with NuGet, where we have the packages.config, or we used to have that, we have a package.json for NPM. So I'm just going to create a package.json file here in the root of my project. It's just a JSON file. And we can see here that we get IntelliSense, of course. And we can see that some of them are required. So name, I can just give it whatever name, version, and then I want to list my dependencies. And here I want to list developer dependencies, dev dependencies, it says. Because I'm not going to use any of these node modules. These are node modules. I'm not going to use them in my app. They are part of my tool chain that I want to use with Visual Studio or from the command line. There's not like I'm putting Node in my ASP.NET app, right? That's not what this means.
I see. So it's more like tooling to help you make your app that you're going to make. And then if someone else on a Mac, for example, wants to work on the same site, they'll be able to have access to the same tooling.
The same tooling, exactly. The tooling follows the project in this case, which is really awesome.
That's
so they can be versioned from project to project without conflicting, just like the DNX and the core CLR can. So let's add Gulp. Gulp is one of the task runners that we want to do.
Okay.
So let's add Gulp, and let's add.
You even got like versions that came up as part of the IntelliSense.
Yeah.
Gulp. That was sweet.
That's crazy.
It's pretty cool, huh?
Totally sweet.
So this actually goes up and gives you like the. It actually queries the NPM registry online, so you get the in IntelliSense super fast, very nice.
Which is the same as you see in Project JSON for NuGet packages now in ASP.NET 5, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we do the same for NuGet, Bower, and NPM. So now I just save this file, okay? My package.json, I just save it. And what's really cool is that we can now see, now I'm switching to the file system here, and we can see that node modules show up. And we can see the Gulp.
Without doing anything,
I didn't do anything. Like normally I would have to go to the command line and write npm install.
Right.
I don't have to do that here. I just save it, and under the hood Visual Studio calls npm install
That's
for me.
awesome.
Yeah. And so now we have dependency node showing up over here. And you can see NPM is one of them. And we now have Gulp and less. So it's still not done here. Now it's done. We can see we have the version showing up. And now I have access to these packages. So that's really neat. I haven't used the command line yet, and I just installed some Node modules. Keep in mind that you don't have to install Node.js here. Visual Studio has that built in.
Oh my goodness.
So just get Visual Studio, you get access to all of this.
So it feels like you're sort of reducing the friction of using modern sort of web tools for building applications, modern web applications.
Exactly. And so now if we want to use Gulp, let's say we want to minify some less files. Let's actually just create some, let's create a less file here. I'm using an extension called add new file. That makes it very easy for me to just add files like this. So let's create a folder called less and add a site.less file in there.
Okay.
So less is this superset of CSS, right? It allows me to do a little bit extra, but I have to compile it back into CSS. So now I can just, let's do something simple like this. So now I have my less file right here. And now I need to compile it into CSS.
Right.
So for that, I'm going to use Gulp. So I just installed Gulp. Now I want to use Gulp. So let's add a Gulp file.js.
Because that's the file that's going to.
This is naming convention, right? It has to be called that to work with Gulp.
This would be like standard, whether it was on a Mac or via Visual Studio. That's just standard.
That's awesome.
It has to be that, yeah. And I have a snippet for that. That's part of Web Essentials. And that makes it very easy for me. I can create a less task right here.
Now it's like, I gotta ask, how do you get the little Gulp logo down the bottom there? Is that an extension now?
It is.
He's got the magic box. He's got his own cool setup here.
Out, man.
I got so many extensions that I always use, and this is one of them. Yeah.
That is very cool.
It makes it easy for me to know what's the difference between C
We should have a
JSON
Mads
here,
extensions show
and
one day.
project has. They all
sweet.
have like little icons, so we can distinguish them.
That is very cool.
It's just an experiment, but I kind of like it. So I'm now requiring Gulp. So this is just JavaScript, right? So now I also want to require my less task. So require, and spell it right, like this. And you see here I get completion here.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, very nice. So now I can very, very easily go in here and create a gulp task. So I want to say, what source is it that I want to compile? Well, I want to compile my site.less file. And I'm just going to pipe that because this is a stream. So I'm going to pipe that to the less function, which I just required. So you see that corresponds to what I just imported. And what's really cool is I get full IntelliSense for this experience.
Yeah.
But here's something new. So this is new to Visual Studio 2015. I actually get IntelliSense for object literals. So if we go in here, we can see I get IntelliSense here. And we've done a lot of work for gulp and grunt to light that up with nice explanations here in tooltips. So let's do compress equals true. So that means I'm minifying now. I compile to less and I minify. And then we just have to pipe it to an output stream. So a file stream that puts it on disk. And there's a helper function here called gulp_dest. And let's just put it in the exact same location. I might want to put it in my .dup root if I had one of those, or a CSS folder or whatever. But I can also just put it directly into the same folder. So now as I save this, the new Task Runner Explorer that shows up right here now has a task called less. Right?
There's like a little nodes and you can see the tasks.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Really? So, and this updates as long as, every time I update my gulp file, I can see the new tasks show up here. And I can simply just execute them by double-clicking right here.
So you can execute just parts of the gulp file as well? That's pretty cool.
You can do it each individual task by itself, or you can do like tasks that chain other tasks. So you can have like an overall build task that like does less compilation, TypeScript, does minification, bundling, and stuff
If you do
like
the file new, if you just get a default file new ASP.NET 5 app, it's got a bunch of those and it has them chained together. And
So if I F5, is it going to run the gulp tasks as well when I
Yep.
F5? Okay.
You can set that up. But let me just show you that I now ran this script,
Okay.
or this task. And we can see that site CSS showed up. And we now have file nesting in the Solution Explorer for ASP.NET 5, which is really nice.
Yeah.
So it automatically nests under here. And we can see we have the minified output as a result.
That's beautiful.
I can always set this up so I can bind, let's say I want to run less when I hit the build, like Control-Shift-B is how I build my app, right? So let me just zoom in here. So if I go down to my task, I can right-click and say, bind this to after build, like that.
Oh, so there's no like, that's really awesome.
So
Just
now-
right-click and then you set it up.
Yeah, so now when I build Control-Shift-B, we should see this is now executing again, right there.
That's awesome.
So does it keep, my muscle memory is intact, and that's really helpful. So
And from like a muscle memory standpoint, it's
Yeah.
pretty much the same workflow for Grunt as well, right? So
Grunt
whether
is the
I'm
same,
using,
yeah.
so whether I'm using Gulp, using Grunt, whatever, from a Visual Studio perspective, you can stay productive, kind of using that same kind of right-click, do it, run the task.
That's really cool.
Yep.
Different task runners, same essential user experience, developer experience.
So the cool thing is here that I now have created a workflow using Node.js tools with Gulp and NPM, but I have not touched the command line. Right? So let me just do the final short demo here where I show
see it.
another app. This is not ASP.NET 5. This is ASP.NET, a website project, ASP.NET 4.5.
Oh,
Just to show that this actually also works on non-ASP.NET 5 project. It works like everywhere,
Okay.
including Cordova.
Totally.
And so here I have like a Gulp file that compiles less files, and it bundles my JavaScript files. And you see it's kind of short. It doesn't really appear to do much, but I do have some tasks that I can execute down here. One of them is the watch task. So because I don't want to be running one of the tasks every time, every time I make a change, I want it to happen automatically when I make the change to the file.
Right-click, run every time. That kind of sucks.
So this watch task, I've actually set up with a binding to project opens. You see here, it's already checked. So whenever I open this project, it automatically starts watching. And here's what the watch task does. It watches all my less files, and it watches all my JS files. And then it runs those scripts that is associated with that. So change a less file, it runs my less task, which I have right up here. It builds my site less, and it puts it in an output folder.
And it does that when you save or when you make a change or when is that?
Exactly, when I
That's
make a
awesome.
change, because it's a file system watcher. So let's start the file system watcher. It would happen if I just opened the project, but let's just do that and then go to here I have this website. So let's just make a change here. I'm going to change the top banner here where it says Visual Studio Web. Let's make that red. And I hit save, and now we have browser link, noticing that there is a change to the compiled CSS file, and it streams that change out to the browser. And within a millisecond or 5, I have the updated CSS, and we can see it displayed here in the browser. So this is a super powerful workflow where we see Visual Studio sitting on top of the command line tools, grunt, bower, npm, gulp, understanding what's going on, and producing an even better experience than if you just use those tools from the command line, which a lot of people do. We think this is a much more productive experience, and I don't have to use the command line for any of this. I can.
Yeah.
I totally can. I can go in at any level here and replace whatever Visual Studio is doing with the command line, or not use any of the Visual Studio, and still use Visual Studio, but keep the command line for this sort of stuff.
That's
it's up to
remarkable.
me, right?
So here's a question. Now, will this stuff work in Visual Studio Community Edition?
Yes.
And now, that's important because Community Edition is free. So if you have Windows, you can literally start using this now.
Yes.
That's remarkable.
So
Okay.
there are extensions. So if you want to try it now with Visual Studio 2013, there are extensions out there that does very much the same thing here. One of them is Package IntelliSense. It gives you IntelliSense for the npm packages and bower components.
Cool.
It also restores those packages automatically when you open a project. And whenever you save package.json or bower.json, it will restore packages as well.
Cool.
Right, so you can get sort of the same workflow in Visual Studio 2013 Update 4.
Okay.
Yep.
That's awesome. Well, let's move on now to Ryan. And now,
Yeah, buddy.
Apache Cordova is interesting, but before we get into that, tell us a little about TypeScript. There's like, I wish I could have been at the meeting where Angular was like, hey, we should use TypeScript. How did that come about?
That was actually a very cool story. So about 6 months ago, I guess, maybe a little bit more than that, they kind of did their early preview of TypeScript, of Angular 2.0, right? And the kind of early versions were based upon this precompiled language that was very TypeScript-like. It was AtScript is what they called it. And the way that they really kind of thought about it was as a superset of TypeScript. Well, the reaction of the community was, it was really one of, hey, you've already got TypeScript out there. We've already got a lot of languages that do this kind of typing on top of JavaScript. Let's not have two things. Let's, big behemoths that you are, Microsoft and Google, go out there and talk to each other. And so we really kind of took a cue from the community there to form a partnership with Google and figure out how we can take the kind of delta, the last little bit that was in AtScript that is not yet in TypeScript, bring that into TypeScript, release it together, and now kind of release Angular 2.0 built on TypeScript alone.
That's awesome.
We just announced that at the kind of NG-Conf, what was that, maybe about a month or so ago, I guess, and got like freaking fantastic reaction from the audience.
Right.
So I'm really, really pumped about the momentum that we got building on
I'm
that.
glad we hugged it out. I mean,
yeah,
seriously, because
totally,
Angular is a
absolutely.
pretty powerful thing, and TypeScript, like I like dynamic languages,
Yeah.
but I just don't necessarily like JavaScript because it lets you do kind of whatever you want, which is good. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's a little scary.
I
TypeScript helps with that.
will always have a soft spot in my heart for JavaScript. I
we
mean,
need to hug it
grew
out.
grew up coding on it, but for larger projects where you've got, let's say maybe 10,000 plus lines of code, right? Serious enterprise class applications, or even if you've got like an open source project where you're accepting pull requests from a large number of people, TypeScript provides a really good way to kind of provide a baseline sanity check that there's just no kind of silly, I won't call them stupid, but unfortunate mistakes that may get made in the code that is a result of JavaScript's fluidity. Yes, yeah, totally.
So we're going to take a step back here and go to Apache Cordova. When we talk about Cordova, usually we think mobile and not web. So tell us a little about what Apache Cordova is for those that might not know about it, and then how it relates to web, and then what we're doing to help with that.
Sure. Well, first I gotta say, you could not have three better guys in the room to be talking about kind of the transition between web and mobile.
Right.
I mean, it is all the stuff that you've heard in the last 20 minutes or so. All those same skills, all those same tools, all those same that same muscle memory, that same familiarity with JavaScript frameworks like Gulp, Grunt, Node. All that same stuff applies equally to tools for Apache Cordova.
Awesome.
So essentially all that you're doing is you're taking your skills as a web developer, your favorite framework of the week, if that's what your kind of notion is, or your existing web application, and you're going to package it up inside of kind of a native container. And that native container can be, in the case of iOS, it's going to be an Objective-C container. In the case of Android, it's going to be a Java container. But either way, that web content is going to get packaged up into a web view inside of this native container and shipped out to become a mobile installed kind of packaged application.
Got it.
And there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to do this, right? Quite frankly, most people, they see that when you kind of go out there and how people are using mobile devices today, there's less and less time spent in the browser and a lot more time spent, clicking on that icon and opening up the app, right? So part of it's just a mind share thing. How do I take my skills as a web developer and participate in the mobile app economy, right? But there's a lot of kind of interesting use cases here that browsers just can't meet today. If you've got offline, you need to be able to support, going through the tunnel, or being in a building with a lot of concrete where there's maybe not going to be a great kind of Wi-Fi signal, or maybe you're kind of going out into kind of the wild somewhere, right? Maybe you need to support offline scenarios. Maybe, browsers are getting better and better about the kind of the capabilities that they expose. Now geolocation is built straight into the browser, right? But that's not the case for a lot of the capabilities of our mobile devices
like
today.
your camera.
Right? Your camera, your contacts, your calendar, the accelerometer. I mean, there's dozens of different capabilities that these little guys expose to us. But from a web browser, you just don't have access to it. And so by taking that web content and packaging it inside of a native container and installing that on your mobile device, you've created a relationship of implied trust with the device capabilities. And now you have access to all of those things like the camera, the accelerometer, et cetera, from directly inside of your JavaScript code.
Interesting.
And here's, at least for me, this is where I get a little bit giddy. It's the same code. Whether you're deploying that code from a JavaScript perspective, from a web, HTML, CSS, JavaScript perspective, whether you're deploying that to iOS or Android or Windows or wherever it's going, you're using a shared JavaScript API. So one code base deployed to all of them. And these days, back when I started as a developer many years ago, we won't say how many years ago it was, cross-browser compatibility was a huge pain in the derriere. It's much less of a problem these days. I mean, I don't want to belittle it. There's still a lot of work that's required. But the difference between IE and Chrome and Safari, it's getting to be less and less. And there's a lot of frameworks, a lot of tooling to help along that way as well. So, still got to test on all your target devices, but in terms of the actual lines of code that you got to write, it's much smaller. You don't have to rewrite that application. Let's say you do need access to offline, or you need access to capabilities, device capabilities. You don't have to rewrite for once in Objective-C and again in Java and again in Windows case you have lots of choices, right? But maybe you still choose to use JavaScript in Windows.
So essentially what Apache Cordova is doing is it's taking your web application and then giving you sort of that boundary where you can now interface with the device itself.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways to deliver that. So we've kind of talked about it as a web application, and that's right in so much as it's always HTML, CSS, JavaScript web technologies.
Right.
You can deliver that HTML, CSS, JavaScript either packaged up with the application itself, or as what we tend to call a hosted app, which is actually, it's truly like living on a server somewhere.
I see.
And then it's just kind of delivered through that web view that's in the container.
So you have two options.
And there's probably more variants of it than that, lots of hybrid kind of things.
It's either here or there or somewhere in between.
Or somewhere in
Got
between.
it.
The downside to doing the hosted app model is that you don't have offline support because you got to connect to the server, but you do have access to all the native device capabilities. And so
That's awesome.
you still get, part of the goodness.
So the first I heard of Microsoft's interaction with Cordova was at TechEd in Houston.
Yeah, buddy. Yeah.
And I was with a control vendor at the time, and we had our own JavaScript framework for Cordova's type stuff. And I was wondering, are we making a framework to build spa applications on top of Cordova, or
Yeah,
are we actually doing tooling for Cordova? Is it both, or what is it?
So I think we take a lot of the same approach that Mads was describing earlier about creating great tooling so that we can endure kind of the rolling tides of fashion that are
Right.
JavaScript, right? So we really try to create great tooling to support frameworks and in general that are not necessarily developed by Microsoft but are developed by the community. And then we kind of closely partner with some of the more kind of popular framework makers, right? Like, so we're out there talking, you know, on a practically daily basis with the guys over at Drifty, makers of the Ionic framework that those of you may be familiar with. Same thing with the makers of Onsen UI, who also make UI controls, JavaScript controls for mobile applications. But then, you know, we're also able to leverage all of the great work that these guys are doing to kind of provide great IntelliSense and support for Angular and Bootstrap, and kind of leverage some of the same work with Grunt and Gulp and Node package managers.
Awesome. Well, we have some questions coming in, and if you have questions, please submit them or use the hashtag ConnectLive. Let's get started. So will VS get some of the features the F12 tools have? This reminds me of Browser Link a little bit.
Well, not really. I think, well, we already have the F12 tools in
in
the
there.
box, and I think actually Cordova and
we
Universal
make use
Apps
of them.
uses them. So.
Oh, interesting.
So for Universal Apps, when you launch today, using JavaScript, right? We'll keep it in web technologies here. The kind of the VS hosted version of the F12 tools launch, like it's actually the exact same code base. Well, modestly modified to be hosted inside of Visual Studio, but 99% same code base.
So it looks like I was confused about Browser Link. Then what's the difference between Browser Link and F12 tools? Are we doing Browser Link still?
Oh yeah. There's some updates that is coming out for that soon. Yeah, we're still doing that, and we actually interface with the F12 tools. So the inspect mode in F12 in the browser, in IE, will also, like when you inspect an element, if Browser Link knows where that element came from in your source code in Visual Studio, it will also give you the inspection all the way through and into your source file.
Got it.
Think about it this way. Browser Link is the communication channel,
Got
and the F12 tools are kind of where it gets exposed.
It's like, where am I?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, next question. Will it be possible to self-host and deploy ASP.NET 5 apps as just a single exe without having to use DNX? I think I know the answer to this, but what do you say?
Interesting. So some people have kind of asked for that. The problem is that if it's a single exe, you still need to know how to boot the CLR, which is what DNX does. Right? So today, your single exe basically has a bunch of magic that knows I'm a .NET thing, I know I'm on Windows, I know about the .NET framework, I know how to get running. That's what DNX does for you. So no, you won't really be able to do something like compile all code down to just a single exe probably. But what you can do is pack your application in such a way so that there's one thing you can double click, which will run your application.
Irrespective of
platform, because you could put several DNXs inside that package, one of which works on Windows on desktop CLR, one of them works on Mac on Mono, or just core CLR that works on all of them eventually, like, you know, just things like that. So you will be able to get something similar to that experience, but it won't be a single file that just magically knows how to run itself. And this is very familiar if you're used to looking at like a lot of other technologies out there. Like you have a thing that you run, and then you give it the application that you're going to run, like Java jar, or like lots of things like that where you do similar kinds of things.
So it's kind of like the application itself is the driver, but you need the car to get in.
Absolutely.
The driver knows how to drive, but we need the car.
So you don't actually generate an executable ever really in DNX land. You generate assemblies, and the DNX can execute your assembly.
Got it. Makes sense.
There could be some tricks, like you could generate a single assembly and like merge it with the DNX executable. There's some things you can do or some tricks you could pull, but essentially you're always going to have the DNX, and you're going to be running it to run your assembly. Maybe you could make it look more like a single exe, but there's not necessarily that much value in that, in like hiding the fact that you're running in a DNX, right?
Got it. All right, next question. When can we expect TypeScript 1.5 support in VS?
Very soon.
Good,
Very,
I like
very
it.
soon.
Very
yeah,
soon.
we're about 90% there right now.
Got it. Perfect.
So, yeah, just check your watch. Right.
Awesome. From Rod, startup.cs is the new global ASAX then? Is there support for global ASAX in ASP.NET 5? Is this something?
I'll let Glenn answer that. I think no.
So, no. It's not really a global ASAX. There's no support for global ASAX. It's not a thing that you would do. And the sorts of things that you would do in global ASAX, some of that probably happens in Startup CS. Maybe you could think of it like that. But it's kind of a different way of viewing the world. Global ASAX is like, here's some events that are going to get called at some point, and you can do some stuff inside of them. Startup CS is, I'm going to let you construct the pipeline that your requests are going to come through, and you can decide to do that however you want.
Oh,
And
it's like stick
kind of
shift now.
It's kind of a different way of thinking about the world. But yeah, for those, there is certainly some things that you probably used to do in global ASCX, and maybe you'll do them in Startup CS, maybe you'll do them somewhere else. But it's not necessarily a strict replacement. But no, we won't have global ASCX in the new stuff.
So how do you handle some of those events, like application error or application end? Where do you do that now?
You have things like middleware. So for example, one of the examples is so in Startup CS, you construct a pipeline. You have a method. You go app.add, and you add a bunch of middleware together. And then what happens is as a request comes into the server, the request is going to get passed through each of the middleware in the order that you added them inside your Startup CS.
It's like the old Owen stuff.
It's exactly like that.
Cool.
So you go add a bunch of times. And then in one of those middlewares might be error page middleware. And then whenever an exception comes back, it'll say, oh, there's an error, and then it'll direct you to the error page.
I see. So in this case, it doesn't even make sense to have a global ASAX because it violates the whole pipeline principle.
Yeah.
Got it.
So so that's how you would do like error pages. There's lots of other cool things you can do. Like you could add an error handling middleware, for example, that we have, which it can detect that an exception has come back, and then could direct you down a completely different pipeline, or back down the same pipeline on a different URL, or you still have a lot of flexibility and a lot of cool stuff you can do.
That's cool. So I remember the Owen interface was literally like, I don't know what the method was, but it was like run. And then there was like, you had to pass it, a handler to do the next thing, which was like some funk of
Yeah,
D.
it's still effectively still the same thing under the covers. In fact, you can add Owen, you can add Owen middleware. So the Startup CS itself isn't Owen in that, because the Owen abstraction is a dictionary of funk of dictionary of string. We have interfaces, strongly typed stuff, but you can just add an Owen middleware to our pipeline, and it works. Like because under the covers, we're doing the exact same thing as what Owen does.
So you could interject in the whole pipeline and do anything, really.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. You can just go I can't remember the exact syntax, but you can pass basically call run and give it a funk. And then you have the requests, and you response.write or do whatever you want in there, right? You can just do your own thing.
That's really cool. All right, so next question, will we be able, it's from Schmelly Englard, will we be able to use node tools from MS Build? It feels like the node tools are different than what MS Build is.
Well, yeah, but node tools, they're all just command line tools, right? And so from MS Build, you can call a command line tool, no problem.
Right.
And so I've done in the past, you can even do it without dropping into the MS Build file itself, like the CS proj file.
Right.
If you go, say, property, right click on your project, say view properties, you have a post build script. You can put stuff in there that calls like npm install to restore your packages, that then calls a gulp task to, let's say, compile the files. You can do all that from there.
This is, by the way, this is exactly how the tools for Apache Cordova work today. Like, MS Build is effectively calling node build tasks for Cordova, because Cordova builds on node.
And effectively, you can actually right-click and run those tasks yourself in the IDE, from what we saw.
Yeah.
So if you look at the file new that you get today, like the new starter web template for ASP.NET 5, it actually wires up. It has a bunch of node stuff. It has a gulp file, and it has this stuff in it. And then inside your project JSON, it'll also hook into pre and post build events.
Got it.
So if you just run that DNU command, like we said at the end, like I talked about earlier, it'll run the node and the node stuff for you as well, which means it'll also get called when MS Build eventually calls that same command via
cool.
Visual Studio, right?
All right, Terry says, the Angular team is moving to Broccoli, I don't even know what that is, to better handle tree structures than Gulp. Any thoughts about support for this? So what is Broccoli? Do you know what it is?
Yeah. So
and then tell us about the Angular team and any thoughts on supporting this.
Yes. So Broccoli is another task runner. So we have built-in support for Gulp and Grunt, and Broccoli is sort of another flavor of that. And they solve the same problems in different ways, right? But they essentially do sort of the same thing. And so we just finished our extensibility for the Task Runner Explorer. So that means that you can add support for Broccoli for any, like your own built, Task Runner that you want, right? So that's coming very soon, and we're going to have some examples on how you can do that. And we're also going to have like probably a project, open source project that would show how you would interface with it. How would you write an extension that would do that?
That's cool.
And so the door is open for anything, including like Fez, Broccoli.
It feels like workplace safety videos where it's like it's been 125 days since our last accident. We should have like a JavaScript framework. It's been 0 days since the last JavaScript framework.
Every week there's a new one. But I mean, like, think about this under the principle of like building great sort of framework agnostic tools, and then as new ones come to rise and really like become kind of effective frameworks that have reached maturity, we'll start to build in kind of better and better first
not only
place
that,
support
but
within
it feels like you're adding an extensibility point to if you really like your particular framework and you build your own tools for it.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Cindy says, in the gulp less task, can you specify all less files with a wildcard?
Yes, you can. So all the so the way Gulp works with the built-in stuff, like what I was showing before with the less task, supports globbing patterns. So you can actually have like a pretty good fidelity on like what to compile and what not. So that might be a good choice for this scenario. And in some cases, you only want to compile 1 or 2 less files because they import the other less files that you have in your project. So in that case, you probably want to have like, I have a situation where I have, I think, 10 less files in a project, and I have one of them I call site.less, and the only thing that's in there are import statements. Because with less, order matters. For CSS, like it's a cascading thing, so order matters. So I control that in less, and then I use Gulp to compile that one less file that then pulls in the rest and does the right thing. So that solves your bundling issue as well. So you don't have to, if you're using less and Gulp today, or you want to, just by those two things and just having the less task, the one I showed before, you have both bundling and minification built in. You don't need any other tasks or any other magic. It's just built in. So,
awesome.
Yep.
From Twitter, Amit says, will these cool stuff on the NPM project JSON, will it work in the new Visual Studio or in previous versions as well?
So Project JSON is new Visual Studio only, 2015. When it comes to package JSON and Bower JSON for NPM and Bower, there are extensions out there, and for Grunt and Gulp as well. So let me name a few. Package IntelliSense, go check that out, and Grunt Launcher. It actually also works with Gulp, but it's called Grunt Launcher. So Package IntelliSense and Grunt Launcher. They're on the VS Gallery, free for download for Visual Studio 2013.
Awesome. Yep. All right, so from Luke, can we do the things you are showing right now with Visual Studio CTP 6?
Yes.
Yeah. That's an easy one. Another one, will browser link work with HTML pages?
Yes, we're starting to make that happen very soon. We need to hook into the ASP.NET 5 pipeline in a way to do that, but we know how to do that. So hopefully by the time Visual Studio is RTMs. Yep.
Nice. Another one, can we get JS, CSS bundling for sites that don't use server-side pages? This is an interesting question because I think it's going to highlight the difference.
Yep. Yes, you can.
And why is that, though?
Because they are not, because we use Gulp or Grunt. If you use one of those task runners, it doesn't know or cares what your server-side or client-side situation is.
Right.
It just knows that here's a less file, I'm going to compile that to CSS. It doesn't even know that it's open in Visual Studio. It doesn't know that it's inside a folder structure that is a website. So yes, totally.
The thing that was fun for me when I was learning this stuff is realizing there's stuff that happens here, and there's stuff that happens here, and sometimes it goes back and forth.
Yep.
So this grunt and less stuff is for client-side type stuff, and then the server-side stuff is obviously for compiling.
But to be fair, it works anywhere. So if you have a
so long as it's a file on disk.
if you have a Windows Form app or a console C# console app, it will work in there too.
Got it.
Yeah.
Another question, can you elaborate on what was mentioned about the close partnering with the Ionic framework guys from Andy?
Yeah. So really there, we're working with them to bring better support for Windows controls, and we're also hoping to bring some Ionic templates into Visual Studio. So those are the first two projects that we're working on, and we've got a bunch of other super secret stuff that hopefully will bubble up in the coming months.
All right, so yes, go ahead.
So just to follow up on that, so
Yeah.
to get the HTML attributes and stuff for Ionic,
Yeah.
so the reason why we don't have that today is because the extensibility story for the HTML editor does not allow us to create new elements. So it's actually elements that are Ionic have defined their own elements. But that's coming.
We got to work on that because of tag
Yes.
helpers, right?
Yeah, well, it's different.
Okay, so let's take a moment then to talk about what tag helpers are, and then tell us how they're different from Ionic. Because to me, it seems like the same thing, but maybe there's a distinction that I'm missing. So what are tag helpers in ASP.NET 5?
So, unless you want to take the tag helper question.
I can start it, and you can
Go for it, I'll feature it, yeah.
So, in essence, it's the same as the Ionic ones, right? It's also the same as an Angular directive. It's also the same as web components or Polymer objects, in one sense that they are interpreted and changed into something different, right?
Got it.
So you can have a tag that's called tag cloud, right? So in your HTML editor, you have an HTML tag called tag cloud, and that's it. That's all there is, no attributes or anything. But when you render that page, you're going to see like all sorts of things happening,
Divs
like
and stuff
divs and
expanded and
yeah, right. So that's how an Angular directive works. Like the user experience of doing that is the same, right? You put some magical tag that doesn't exist on a page, and something happens. But that all happens on the client side.
Yeah.
When we're talking about tag helpers, we do it on the server side. So that's one of the differences.
So we're like kind of blurring the boundary here on where is this happening now?
Yep. And also tag helpers have the ability to augment existing HTML tags, which is really powerful. So you can have, like say you have a regular script tag, but you want to have CDN support, you want to support fingerprinting, like for cache busting situations, but it's just a script tag. That can all happen on the server side automatically now without you having to do much else.
My first experience, I started to use tag helpers and realized some of the great awesomeness was I had link tags which were part of my menu, right on the side of my page it was, and I thought, I want the one that's the page that I'm on. I want it to have a different background. That's the one that's clicked, right? Like I've clicked that link, it's got a black background. And I had a tag helper that was I just added to links that said, this is the view that you're going to be black on. If this is the view that's being rendered, then you're black. And that just worked. So it didn't matter how you got to a page. If you type the URL directly into the bar, that link would go black, because I would say on my tag, just a normal link tag, I would put a property which tag helpers would then find and replace basically with CSS if it was the right URL that I was coming in on.
That's interesting.
And it happened on the server, and it was just as far as the browser concerned, this link just had this selected style all the time. Right, but then it was great. Didn't matter how I got in. Like that sort of logic was always a little bit finicky in the past. I remember writing it before because the place where you added the CSS class, sometimes there were ways you could get to your page where it didn't get added, and things like that. And tag helpers made that really awesome. And that was the point where it clicked for me, and I went, this is really great stuff.
Well, the sophistication now of actual Visual Studio, knowing when to, because now you can sort of mix and match tag helpers with Angular directives and have crazy stuff happen all at the same time.
You can have a tag now, an HTML element that is both an existing HTML element, a tag helper, and an Angular directive.
All at the same time.
Yeah.
My head just exploded. All right, Thomas, let's see what he has to say. What about WCF services in ASP.NET 5? Full framework, will there be something like App Builder use WCF?
App Builder use WCF? Probably not. So there are a lot of people doing some work on WCF. Like Adam, for example, right now there's a lot of work on getting WCF client into Core CLR, so you'll be able to call WCF services from Core CLR and things like that. App Builder use WCF. I'm not sure. Probably I don't think there's any plans for it right now. We've got Web API that integrates with the pipeline in that part of the ASP.NET 5 stack. The point of part of the great thing that happened in the new MVC, that's part of MVC 5 family, is that they merge Web API and MVC. So when you go use MVC, you've already got a nice way to like hit endpoints and get JSON and do all the stuff that Web API gave you. If you need WCF, I think you're on full framework and you kind of use WCF the same way that you've used WCF in the past. It doesn't really fully integrate that way. What happens in the future, I don't know, but I think at the moment there's no plan. No, there's no use MVC method in the pipeline as far as I know.
I think people forget that the core CLR is literally the CLR that can run anywhere. It's like this portable CLR, and so obviously it's not going to be like a full CLR quite yet, but you're adding things as you go along.
Yeah. I mean, so I think the plan initially is it'll have WCF clients, so you'll be able to call WCF services, but you won't necessarily be able to create them on core CLR.
Got it.
At least to begin with. I don't know.
All right, so the next question is, will ASP.NET 5 use MS Build?
So in Mads' solution earlier, you've got the project JSON file. Now, MS Build was not cross-platform, especially when we very first started. There was like no plans that it would ever become cross-platform. So at the beginning, we couldn't kind of completely base ourselves on it. We have this project JSON file, which we kind of like, and it's really human readable and nice. However, there is a project file. It's called an xproj now, which is MS Build. And inside Visual Studio knows about project files, it knows about MS Build files. So that project file is an MS Build file, and there is a target that will eventually go and just call the like DNU command line utilities to go and build your application. So there is an MS Build file. You can do some MS Build stuff in there. And you can use kind of MS Build as your orchestration framework to be able to orchestrate builds across a bunch of projects and stuff like that. It's not, so it is there and it does make use of it. However, it's not a mandatory component of the system. If you're on Mac and you're using Sublime, you don't need an xproj, you don't need MS Build. Right. If you want to use Fake or Sake or one other type of orchestration system to be able to put everything together, you can do that as well. Yeah.
Cool. So just a little kudos from Hanuma. I loved working on AngularJS. I love the fact that the new VS 2015 has these Angular templates. I'd like to thank the devs working on those templates. Tooling team, awesome. Another question from Boris. Will ASP.NET MVC 6 get native support for SSR support? Now, okay, so here's my confusing. So we're going ASP.NET 5, right? Is the new version MVC 6?
Yeah.
Okay.
For MVC, yeah.
Oh, okay. So the question.
So MVC 6 it's not just MVC. So previously you had MVC and you had Web API, and there were two things. Now there's MVC 6, and it is both of those things in one.
Got it.
So things that you would. So what that means is that inside one controller, I could return JSON and I could return a view. Or so for Web API guys, you can return views now. For MVC guys, you can return JSON now, right? Like it's one web framework. Previously, you would get like there was a seam in the middle where like you both had routing. Web API and MVC had routing, but they were slightly different, and you had to kind of set both of them up. It wasn't one. Now it's just one. So MVC 6 is the name for everything that used to be Web API and used to be MVC, and as well as like web pages in the future and stuff like that. There's one web framework, and it's called MVC 6.
All right, and the question from Boris was, will it get native support for SSRS reports?
So SQL Server
reporting.
SQL Server reporting services.
I don't know.
Yeah,
actually, we should ask a SQL person.
Right?
Yeah.
Vincent asks, is there a JavaScript editor in VS CTP 6?
There is, yes.
Nice. All right, so we are about out of time, so I'll give you each about 30 seconds to plug a website or something that we can go look to learn more, and maybe parting words. We'll start over here with Matt.
All right, yeah, I just, if you haven't tried out Visual Studio 2015 yet, I would strongly encourage you to do that. And
For free.
For free, of course, yeah. And try it out and play around with some of the new stuff that we have, including the Bower, NPM, Grunt, and Gulp. It is not scary. It's not putting Node in your apps. Keep the workflow you got, but try to see what it is to harness the power of those tools now that, which we didn't talk about. Web Essentials no longer have the compilers for Less and Sass, so you're kind of either have to use a different extension or use this.
Or use what everyone else is using.
So it's not scary at all. Check out the JavaScript editor experience. It's like a lot better. JS doc comments and ECMAScript 6 goodies are everywhere there. So VS 2015 for a web developer is not just a new update to Visual Studio 2013. It is a huge release with a lot of new things.
Got it.
So,
all right, Ryan.
Cool. Yeah, I'd say if you're an ASP.NET developer, go download, go try the VS Cordova tools. If you got VS 2013, you can install an extension. If you download 2015, comes with the package. And if you're a web developer, you're going to feel right at home building a mobile application. Give it a try. If you got any questions as you kind of go along that path and try something new, I'd say find us on Twitter. We're at VS Cordova Tools. The PM team, the whole product team monitors it. I'm super active in it.
Awesome.
Or you can go to Stack Overflow, find anything with tag Visual Studio Cordova, and we're on there answering questions for developers all the time. So.
All right, Glenn.
So ASP.NET vnext/vnext. In particular, has a bunch of links. There's some documentation. There's some videos. In particular, there's community stand-up videos we do every week. So you guys should jump on, go tune into that if you want. Scott Hanselman and Damien Edwards and Galloway and a few other people get together and just talk every week about stuff that's happening in ASP.NET 5, stuff that's up and coming and things like that. They're great if you want to tune in. But GitHub, everything in the stack is open source, if you didn't know.
Awesome.
From Core CLR, everything all the way. So go to GitHub. You can go to github.com/ASP.NET/home. It gives you like a landing page. It has some wiki content that kind of gets updated when I get to it, and a bunch of issues. You can log issues there. But all of the source code and all the repositories are there. So you can look at the code, you can log issues, you can talk to the developers directly.
Awesome.
You can send us a pull request because that casing of that word is wrong. All of those sorts of things.
Awesome. Well, thanks for watching another episode of Connect Live. We'll see you next time.